The white flag. The white feather tucked into Carlos Hathcock's boonie hat caught the first light of dawn as he crouched in the elephant grass 30 meters from what remained of the village of Bin Din. Through his inertial scope, he watched North Vietnamese soldiers methodically searching the smoldering huts, their AK-47s sweeping doorways where shadows might conceal American stragglers. The acrid smell of burned thatch mixed with cordite hung in the humid Vietnamese air like a funeral shroud. Hathcock had arrived at Firebase Charlie 3 days earlier with orders that made even hardened Marines uncomfortable. The mission briefing was simple: eliminate high-value targets disrupting supply convoys along Highway 1. His reputation preceded him, the sniper they called White Feather, the man who could put a bullet through a playing card at 500 yards. But what command hadn't mentioned was that this sector had become a maze of civilian displacement, families fleeing the fighting only to find themselves trapped between American positions and North Vietnamese forces who considered any movement suspicious. The morning had started routinely enough. Hathcock positioned himself in the tree line, overlooking Bin Din before sunrise, watching for the supply coordinator whose radio intercepts had been directing attacks on Marine convoys. Through his scope's narrow field of view, he identified his target, a thin man in a clean uniform moving between huts with obvious authority. One shot, clean, mission accomplished. But as Hathcock prepared to withdraw, mortars began falling from the hills. The dead coordinator's unit was retaliating blindly, assuming American forces occupied the village. Within minutes, the settlement became a killing ground, and that's when Hathcock saw them, an elderly man sheltering 3 children and a pregnant woman in a bamboo storage shed that offered concealment but no protection. The family had been gathering rice when the shooting started. Now they were pinned between incoming mortars and a North Vietnamese squad advancing house to house, checking each structure for American spotters. In 15 minutes, maybe 20, the soldiers would reach that shed. They would assume the family had been collaborating with Americans. The outcome was inevitable. Standard sniper doctrine was clear: observe, eliminate the target, withdraw without engagement. Hathcock's mission was complete. The rational choice was extraction. But watching the pregnant woman shelter her children as mortar fragments tore through the thin walls around them, something in his tactical calculus shifted. He had been trained to be invisible, to kill from distance without emotional involvement. He had not been trained for this moment when silence meant watching a family die for being in the wrong place when he pulled his trigger. Hathcock reached into his field kit and found a strip of white cloth from his medical dressing. His hands moved without conscious thought, tying it to his rifle barrel. What he was about to do violated every principle of sniper warfare, but the alternative was unthinkable. If stories like this make you question what you'd do in someone else's boots, tell us in the comments how you imagine you'd react in this camp. And stay with us for the next chapters. What does courage look like when following orders means abandoning conscience? Standing up in full view of both the North Vietnamese patrol and any spotters in the hills, Hathcock made himself the most visible target for miles. The white cloth streamed from his rifle barrel like a banner of surrender, though surrender was the furthest thing from his mind. He walked slowly toward the village center, each step a calculated risk that defied everything he'd learned about survival in Vietnam's hostile terrain. The effect was immediate. The mortars stopped first. The crews in the hills couldn't risk hitting their own people if an American was walking among them. The patrol froze, weapons trained on this lone Marine who had appeared from nowhere, carrying what looked like a flag of truce. The humid air fell silent except for the distant rumble of helicopters over the South China Sea. In broken Vietnamese learned during cultural briefings at Firebase Charlie, Hathcock called out, "Family, children, no soldiers here." He pointed deliberately at the shed, then at himself, then at the white cloth. The message was unmistakable. He was claiming responsibility for any American presence in the village and requesting safe passage for civilians. What happened next defied the brutal mathematics of warfare that had governed this sector for months. The patrol leader, perhaps recognizing the unprecedented nature of this gesture, slowly lowered his weapon. For 90 seconds that felt like hours. 30 armed men watched one American sniper guarantee the safety of a Vietnamese family with nothing but a strip of white cloth and the courage to stand exposed. The family emerged slowly. The old man first, hands visible, then the children, finally the pregnant woman who could barely walk. Hathcock remained motionless in the village center, the white cloth making him a target for any sniper or mortar crew that chose to resume fighting. The North Vietnamese soldiers escorted the civilians to the tree line, then melted back into the jungle like morning mist. Only when the last figure disappeared did Hathcock lower his rifle and begin his own careful withdrawal. Back at Firebase Charlie, the debriefing was routine. Hathcock filed a standard mission report. Target eliminated, no American casualties. He never mentioned the family or the white cloth, but word spread among the Marines about the sniper who had walked into a crossfire carrying a flag of truce. "Heard you had some excitement out there, White Feather," said Corporal Jimmy Martinez, cleaning his M16 in the humid evening air. "Just another day in paradise," Hathcock replied, but his tone carried something different. Some called it tactical genius, using the enemy's own code of conduct to achieve objectives without additional shooting. Others whispered about reckless sentiment that compromised operational security. Staff Sergeant Doug Wilson, a veteran of 3 tours, pulled Hathcock aside near the perimeter wire. "What you did out there, that wasn't in any manual I ever read." "Manual doesn't cover everything," Hathcock said quietly. But Marines who served with him began to notice changes. Hathcock started carrying white cloth strips in his kit, and his methods subtly evolved. He became more selective about targets, more careful about civilian proximity, more aware of the human geography surrounding his scope's narrow field of view. How long before an act of mercy becomes a burden too heavy to carry? 3 weeks after the incident at Bin Din, Hathcock sat in the Firebase Charlie mess hall, mechanically eating sea rations while rain drummed against the corrugated metal roof. The monsoon season had arrived early, turning the red dirt roads into rivers of mud and making sniper operations nearly impossible. Mail call brought letters from home, and Hathcock stared at the envelope from his wife Jo, postmarked Little Rock, Arkansas. Her handwriting was familiar, but the contents felt foreign. News about church socials, her job at the bank, their neighbor's boy who'd been drafted. She wrote about seeing protesters on television, young people burning flags and chanting about ending the war. "I don't understand what they're protesting," she wrote. "You're fighting for freedom over there. Everyone knows that." Across the mess hall, Corporal Martinez was arguing with Sergeant Wilson about a news report they'd heard on Armed Forces radio. Something about civilian casualties in the Mekong Delta, body counts that didn't match operational reports. The conversation grew heated. "You believe everything you hear on the radio now?" Wilson challenged. "I believe what I see with my own eyes," Martinez shot back. Hathcock folded his wife's letter and walked outside into the rain. The white cloth strips he'd begun carrying felt heavier in his pocket, not from their physical weight, but from what they represented. Each strip was a reminder of that moment in Bin Din when doctrine had collided with conscience, and conscience had won. That evening, a new Marine arrived at Firebase Charlie, Private First Class David Thompson, 19 years old and fresh from advanced infantry training at Camp Pendleton. His uniform was still crisp, his boots unscuffed, his eyes bright with the certainty that came from believing everything you'd been taught. "Heard about you, sir," Thompson said to Hathcock during evening chow. "They say you're the best shot in the Corps. Can't wait to see you take out some gooks." The word hung in the humid air like a physical presence. Hathcock set down his coffee and looked at the young Marine. "That's not what we do here, son." "But, sir, we're here to kill the enemy, right? Stop the spread of communism." "That's what they told us at Pendleton." Hathcock thought about the pregnant woman in the storage shed, the way her hands had trembled as she shielded her children. He thought about the North Vietnamese patrol leader who had lowered his weapon when he saw the white cloth. He thought about his wife's letter, filled with certainty about freedom and righteousness. "Sometimes the enemy looks different than you expect," he said finally. That night, lying on his cot listening to artillery fire in the distance, Hathcock wondered if anyone back home would understand what he'd learned in that village. The white feather in his hat had become a symbol of precision and skill, but the white cloth in his pocket represented something else entirely, the moment when killing became more complicated than anyone had prepared him for. Do you think you'd cling to what you were taught back home, or to what your own eyes see in a place like this? Comment which side you'd lean toward, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. What happens when the truth you live doesn't match the truth you were taught? 2 months into his tour, Hathcock began to notice patterns that the official reports never captured. Vietnamese civilians weren't the faceless masses described in briefings. They were farmers worried about rice harvests, mothers protecting children, old men who remembered French colonial rule and wondered if Americans would be different. The monsoon rains had given way to dry season, and with it came increased patrol activity around Firebase Charlie. Private Thompson had been assigned to Hathcock's unit, eager to prove himself in combat. During a reconnaissance mission near the hamlet of Dong Ha, 30 kilometers north of their base, Thompson spotted movement in a tree line and reached for his rifle. "Wait," Hathcock whispered, adjusting his scope. Through the magnified lens, he saw not enemy soldiers but children playing near a water buffalo. "Just kids." "How can you tell?" Thompson asked, frustrated. "They all look the same from here." "Look closer," Hathcock said. "See the way they move? No weapons, no military bearing, just children being children." The lesson extended beyond target identification. During village patrols, Hathcock began teaching Thompson to observe rather than assume. An elderly woman hanging laundry wasn't necessarily a Viet Cong spy. A man working in rice paddies wasn't automatically a combatant. The white cloth in Hathcock's pocket had become a reminder that split-second decisions carried consequences that lasted far beyond the trigger pull. Back at Firebase Charlie, tensions were rising among the Marines. News from the Tet Offensive had shaken everyone's confidence in official progress reports. Sergeant Wilson pulled Hathcock aside after evening chow, his face grim in the harsh light of the mess hall. "Command wants higher body counts from your sector. They're asking questions about why your kill ratio is dropping." Hathcock nodded slowly. Since Bin Din, he'd become more selective about targets, more careful about verification. The white cloth had changed his tactical approach in ways that were hard to explain in after-action reports. "I engage confirmed military targets, Wilson. Just like the manual says." "Manual doesn't mention that you're carrying surrender flags in your kit," Wilson said quietly. "Word gets around, Hathcock. Some people are asking questions about your methods." That night, Thompson approached Hathcock's bunk with a question that had been eating at him for weeks. "Sarge, why'd you join the Marines? I mean, what made you want to come here?" Hathcock thought about his childhood in Arkansas, hunting with his father, the pride in his mother's eyes when he enlisted. He thought about duty, honor, country, all the words that had seemed so clear back home. "Thought I knew," he said finally. "Turns out, knowing and understanding are different things." "What do you mean?" "You'll see," Hathcock said, fingering the white cloth in his pocket. "This place has a way of teaching you things nobody prepares you for." The next morning brought news that would test everything Hathcock had learned. Intelligence reports indicated a high-value target in a village suspected of harboring Viet Cong leadership. The mission would require precise shooting in a populated area, exactly the kind of operation that had led to his moment of truth at Bin Din. Can a man change his purpose without betraying his duty? The village of An Loc sat in a valley 20 kilometers southwest of Firebase Charlie, surrounded by rice paddies and bamboo groves that provided perfect concealment for snipers. Intelligence indicated that a North Vietnamese regiment commander was using the village as a staging area for attacks on Highway 1. Hathcock's orders were specific: eliminate the target without civilian casualties. But as he and Thompson approached their overwatch position in the pre-dawn darkness, Hathcock carried more than just his rifle and standard equipment. The white cloth strips had multiplied in his kit, each one a reminder of Bin Din and the choice he'd made to value life over doctrine. Through his unertal scope, Hathcock studied the village as it awakened. Children walked to the communal well, women prepared morning rice. Old men gathered in the shade of a banyan tree, talking quietly and smoking pipes. It looked exactly like what it probably was, a farming community trying to survive a war that had engulfed their homeland. "There," Thompson whispered, pointing to a figure in military uniform moving between the huts. "That's got to be him." Hathcock adjusted his scope and studied the target. The man wore the insignia of a regimental commander and moved with obvious authority. But something nagged at him. The way the villagers interacted with the soldiers, the absence of fear in the children's faces, the casual manner in which weapons were carried. "Something's not right," Hathcock murmured. As he watched, a remarkable scene unfolded. The supposed enemy commander knelt beside a sick child, speaking gently with the mother. A medic appeared with a field kit, treating the child's fever with careful attention. The soldiers shared their rations with villagers, played with children, helped repair a damaged roof. Thompson was growing impatient. "We've got a clear shot, Sarge. Why are we waiting?" Hathcock's finger rested on the trigger, but his mind was elsewhere. The white cloth in his pocket seemed to pulse with significance. What was he witnessing? Enemy soldiers providing medical care, sharing food with civilians, acting exactly as American troops were supposed to act in liberated areas. The truth hit him like a physical blow. This wasn't a Viet Cong stronghold. It was a North Vietnamese unit conducting what they probably called hearts and minds operations. The enemy was following the same manual American forces used, trying to win civilian support through kindness and aid. The regimental commander he'd been sent to eliminate was doing exactly what American officers were supposed to do, protecting and caring for non-combatants. "We're leaving," Hathcock said suddenly. "What?" "But sir, the mission parameters have changed. No clear shot without civilian risk." It was a lie, but it was also the truth. Hathcock couldn't reconcile what he was seeing with everything he'd been taught about the enemy. If North Vietnamese soldiers could show mercy, if they cared for sick children and shared food with hungry families, what did that mean about the nature of this war? That night at Firebase Charlie, Hathcock filed his report. Target not acquired due to civilian proximity. But he kept the real discovery to himself, locked away with the white cloth that had become his talisman of doubt and conscience. What do you do when the enemy starts looking human? 3 months later, the landmine that ended Hathcock's tour in Vietnam exploded under his jeep during a routine supply run to Firebase Delta. The blast shattered his left leg and sent shrapnel into his back, but he survived. As medical helicopters carried him to the evacuation hospital in Da Nang, he clutched the white cloth strips that had become his most precious possessions. At the Naval Hospital in Oakland, California, Hathcock faced the complicated process of returning to a world that expected simple answers about a complex war. Physical therapy was painful, but the psychological adjustment proved more difficult. Nurses and doctors asked polite questions about his service. Family members wanted heroic stories. Fellow Marines shared war tales over beer, but Hathcock found himself increasingly quiet about his experiences. "You were a sniper, right?" his brother-in-law asked during a family barbecue in Arkansas. "How many did you get?" Hathcock thought about the pregnant woman in the storage shed, the North Vietnamese commander treating a sick child, the moment when killing had become more complicated than anyone prepared him for. "Enough," he said simply. 6 months after his medical discharge, a Vietnamese interpreter working with refugee resettlement programs in California tracked him down. The man carried a message that had passed through underground networks, refugee camps and church organizations. A communication from a world Hathcock thought he'd left behind. "There is a family," the interpreter said carefully, "from a village called Bin Din. They asked me to find the American sniper with the white feather. They wanted you to know that the baby was healthy, that they survived. The grandfather said to tell you that courage looks the same in any language." Hathcock stared at the interpreter, remembering the terrified faces in the storage shed, the 90 seconds when 30 armed men had watched him guarantee civilian safety with nothing but strips of white cloth and the willingness to stand exposed. "He said something else," the interpreter continued. "He said they keep white cloth in their house now, as a reminder that even in the darkest times, some people choose to protect life instead of taking it." That evening, Hathcock sat alone on his porch in Arkansas, holding the white cloth strips that had traveled with him from the jungles of Vietnam to the quiet suburbs of America. His wife Jo found him there, staring at the pieces of fabric she'd never seen before. "What are those?" she asked. "Reminders," he said quietly. "Of what?" "That sometimes the most powerful weapon is the willingness to lower it." Hathcock never spoke publicly about the incident at Bin Din. In a conflict where moral certainty was as scarce as clean water, he discovered that individual choices could create unexpected moments of humanity. The white cloth became his private memorial to the day when doctrine had collided with conscience, and conscience had won. Years later, when young Marines asked him about combat, Hathcock would tell them about precision, wind calculation, and target identification. But he kept the deeper truth to himself, that war's most important lessons weren't found in any manual, and that courage sometimes meant choosing not to shoot. The white cloth strips remained in his possession until his death, a reminder that even in warfare's most calculated violence, small acts of humanity could echo across decades and continents, proving that mercy was harder to forget than hatred. If this story reminded you that even in the darkest times, small acts of humanity still matter, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story. What stories do we choose to remember, and which ones do we choose to forget?